Hello and welcome to Old Testament Foundations Module number 11. This week we continue with the unfolding story of God's redemptive plan as we come to the book of Judges. The book of Judges so very logically flows on from the book of Joshua. In fact, it commences with these words in Judges chapter 1. It says, "After the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, 'Who will be first to go up and fight for us against the Canaanites?'" In chapter 1, we read of what essentially was an incomplete conquest of the promised land. Yes, much of the promised land had been taken and established for the people of God. And yet we discover that there were significant tracts of the land and of the peoples who had not been successfully driven out. These would become the perennial thorn in the side for the nation of Israel. And then, of course, as we move into chapter 2, we discover that we move into a period of time in which the people of God have fundamentally fallen for the trap of becoming involved with not only the peoples of the land, but also in their worship systems. Listen to what it says in chapter 2, reading from verse 10. "After that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up, who neither knew the Lord, nor what had been done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the people around them. They provoked the Lord to anger, because they forsook him and served the Baals and the Ashereths." And indeed what we discover now for the next 400 years, Israel would repeatedly fall into this cycle which we often describe as the cycle of apostasy, where they would turn their back upon God, forget about God. And God, in consequence of their sinful choices, would allow them to begin to be oppressed by the countries, the peoples around about them. And then after a period of time, as God's people recognized the foolishness of their ways, they would cry out to God, and God, in his covenant faithfulness, would then send a delivering judge. These delivering judges were not necessarily judges as we often think in terms of judicial judges. In many cases, they were military leaders who would be able to lead the nation of Israel in driving back their enemies. And following on from the defeat of their enemies, we find that Israel would then enter into a time of relative peace. And yet, as is so often the case for all of us, when life is going well and peace abounds, people tend to turn their hearts away from God. And so we would find that Israel once again slumps into sin. And in consequence of their sin, God will allow others of their surrounding nations to begin to oppress them once more, until finally in their devastation they would cry out to God for deliverance. And God again would mercifully send a delivering judge. We'll work our way through the 6 major and 6 minor judges who are presented for us in the book of Judges. And we will see as the pages of Judges continue to unfold that the judges themselves are anything but perfect individuals. In fact, from some judges at the beginning who seem to be fundamentally committed to God, we see increasingly judges who have significant not only character flaws but great spiritual flaws as well. And yet, by the time we are nearing the end of the book of Judges, we find a few cameo stories which in a sense give us a picture of the tragic spiritual degradation that had come across the whole of this wonderful land of promise and these people of God. We will look at these stories and in one sense shudder as we read them. But in amongst all of this, there is a statement which is made 3 times in the closing chapters of the book. At that time, Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It's a tragic indictment upon the nation of Israel in so many ways, because God himself was to be their king. And yet repeatedly they had rejected God's kingship over them. And so we find, as the pages draw to a close, that there is a sense of yearning that there would be one who would be raised up, who would at least be a king in God's place for them, a king that they could see. And all of this is setting the stage delightfully for what will follow in 1 and 2 Samuel. Yes, it will be a tragic journey in so many ways, and yet a journey that reminds us powerfully of the need to stay true to God, and yet at the same time of the incredible covenant faithfulness of God to his people, even when they have erred again and again, because God in his love will fulfill his redemptive plan. Well, may God bless you as you study this week.